Hi, and thank you for joining us today for the Jewish Genealogical Society of Georgia. We're a committee within the Bremen Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. Today, I'd like to present our speaker in period costume, speaking on the war between the states and the Jews of the Confederacy, Lunelle Siegel. Thank you.
The first state to secede was South Carolina, and this was actually in 1860 in December. Then quickly, and there's even a song about this called the Bonnie Blue Flag, then quickly Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida all raised on high the Bonnie Blue Flag that bears a single star. And then, of course, Louisiana and Texas. And again, you can see that's all very quickly, January and February. In February of 1861, a provisional Congress forms and a constitutional convention was held. The Constitution was adopted and the government of the Confederate States of America was born. There was inauguration of a president who was appointed as an interim president by that Congress, Jefferson Davis. I'm sure some of you have heard of him. Then there was a turning point. See, the Confederacy at that point was only made up of 7 states. The turning point was April 15th when the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, called for 75,000 troops to be brought forth from the remaining states to put down the rebellion. Virginia knew, as did Tennessee, that they were on the edge. They were on the border. If you look at the geography, they knew they would be the battlefield if a war did occur. And so when that call for troops came along, quickly Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia threw their stakes in with the Confederacy. Of course, you know about Fort Sumter. South Carolina defended their sovereign soil, in their view, against a resupply of what they viewed was territory that belonged to them, that federal fort, that they had seized when they left the Union. So there we have it. That's the history. So now, when we start talking about our Confederate service, there's 3 different types of service that one of your ancestors could have had. First of all, a civilian government official. And I'm going to give you some examples of those. Number 2, actual military service. I'm going to give you a case study today about that and give you some resources to research your Confederate military ancestor service. And then finally, material aid to the cause. You know, a woman who sewed flags or made bandages might be providing material aid to the cause. There's some more interesting examples of Jewish ladies who we will talk about in our program today, but that just gives you some examples. So let's talk about civilian government officials. What could this be? Well, if it's in the federal level, the Confederate States of America, it would be the executive, judicial, legislative branch. It could be elected or appointed. It could be your local postmaster for the Confederate Postal Service. Yes, the Confederacy had a post office. It could be on the state level. When each state, before they seceded, there was a constitutional or secession convention. And each state voted to decide to leave the Union and to join the Confederacy. So those secession convention delegates would be a civilian government official. Also, any state level officer, whether it be governor. So the lady you described, Gary, that had the, quote, Civil War governor from Georgia, she would have him as a civilian government official. Local, that would be your clerk of the court, your local county judge. All these would be considered civilian government officials and would be eligible to be a Confederate ancestor. Here is a lithograph of the presidential cabinet of Jefferson Davis, which is the Confederate cabinet. Now, I'm going to point out one fellow here. You probably recognize in the middle one man that's not in the cabinet. That's Army of Northern Virginia General Robert E. Lee. So he's not actually in the cabinet. He's briefing President Davis and the cabinet on the progress of the war. But here is the man on the left-hand side, the affable-looking fellow, second from the left, seated. This is the first personality that I'm going to describe for you today. And this is Judah P. Benjamin. Has anyone heard of Mr. Benjamin? Okay, well, some of you haven't. Those of you who have, he has a wonderful story. I'm not going to give you the whole story, but I'm going to give you a few high points because he is one of my favorites. And being from Florida, I have a strong connection to him. Some historians have called him the brains of the Confederacy. Others have tried to blame him for the South's defeat. He was a Sephardic Jew born in the West Indies, and as a child, his family moved to South Carolina. He was a prodigy. At age 14, he studied law at Yale. He practiced law in New Orleans and became very prominent in the law profession there. Fast. His friends described him as easy grace in manner, soft voice, not only pleasant in sound, but always carried something worth hearing. He loved good food, and ladies seemed to love him. He married a Catholic Creole and fathered a daughter. He built a mansion for her called Belle Chase, which was a beautiful plantation in Louisiana that today's ruins do exist. But unfortunately, as a married couple, they didn't get along too well. She moved to Paris pretty early in their marriage, and he tried his luck as a sugar planter. He had 150 slaves, and he was a pioneer in sugar farming. By all accounts, he abided to the, quote, Christian, unquote, form of Southern slavery, and was spoken about by affection from his former slaves some 50 years later in the slave narratives. In December 31, 1860, he was the senior senator from Louisiana. So he was serving in the United States Senate. He spoke on December 31, New Year's Eve, 1860, after South Carolina had seceded, to defend the rights of the southern state to secede from the Union. It was a holiday season. The gallery was filled with a crowd, and spirits were high, but tension was high as well. He wore a simple black suit, a pocket watch with a long chain hung across his vest, and he was a short, portly man with black curly hair and black eyes. He was affable and cosmopolitan, a dapper dresser, and venerable gambler, and had a silvery voice. This is how he was described. He spoke for more than an hour. It was unusual for a speech to be less than that in those days. His voice was distinct and clear, holding the audience spellbound. He reminded his colleagues that incessant attacks upon the sensibilities of the high-spirited Southerners were insulting and would lead to further secession. At the end of remarks, he held his pocket watch in one hand and held the other hand in his pocket, and he said, "And now, senators, you may carry desolation into our peaceful land, and with torch and fire you may set our cities in flames, but you can never subjugate us." With that, he released the grasp on his watch chain as if the chains with which the North and South in bondage were now severed. He put his hand in his pocket and turned to take his seat and added, "And never enslaved and servable race you can never make of us. Never, never, never." So that was a notable speech. Over the 5 years that the Confederacy existed, he would serve 3 cabinet positions: Attorney General, Secretary of War, and finally Secretary of State, making him, I believe, for about 100 years, the highest-ranking Jewish person in government in America. He was the sounding board and closest advisor to President Davis, and he acted as a lightning rod to deflect Davis's unpopular actions. In her autobiography, the First Lady, Verena Davis, said that Benjamin spent 12 hours each day with her husband, tirelessly shaping every aspect of Confederate strategy and tactic. Now, this is a fun story. This shows you his personality and wit. The Federals were about to siege Richmond. Lee had not been successful in holding the line in Virginia, and Petersburg had occurred, and Lee was trying to protect what he could of the army. Gettysburg happened, you know that whole story, Appomattox Courthouse, and the end is upon the Confederacy. So, word had had come that they were on the doors of Richmond, the Federal Army, and so all the cabinet officials decided to leave post-haste. A bounty had been put by President Lincoln on all the heads of state of the Confederacy. 40,000, which is $3 million in today's dollars, had been placed on Mr. Benjamin's head. A nice sum. So he was definitely a man to be concerned about his person. Now, he was not a good horse rider, and the men were riding on horse after they arrived in Georgia, and I can't recall the exact place, but I'll tell you later. He departed company with the other cabinet officials, and he had his own secret escape plan. And his plan involved adopting a disguise of a French man seeking to purchase land in Georgia. And his name that he adopted was Monsieur Bonfals. And because his wife was French Creole and he lived in Louisiana, he did speak fluent French. So he had a hat, goggles, cloak. He had grown a full beard, so he was quite well disguised. He made his way into Florida, and he escaped by way of, and if anyone knows where this is, Manatee County or Bradenton near Sarasota. And you can see where he spent the night. Judah Benjamin slept here at the Gamble Mansion State Historic Park on the Manatee River. He was almost captured a couple of times, but he did escape thanks to some Confederate gentlemen who were working with something called the Cow Cavalry, who my first ancestor I discovered was in, and he was able to escape to England. He there became Queen's Counsel to Lancashire County in 1872. He became so successful that by 1877 he would accept no case for a fee less than 300 guineas, which is $1,500 today. He died 1884 in Paris and is buried next to his wife. The United Daughters of the Confederacy Paris chapter placed a special tombstone for him in 1930. Now, what is so interesting about his name, Monsieur Bonfals? In French means good disguise. So that's Judah Benjamin. I'd like to briefly tell you about David Yulee Levy. I told you that Judah Benjamin was a senator from Louisiana. Well, he was the second Jewish senator in the nation. The first Jewish senator was David Yulee Levy from that great state of Florida. So you have two Jewish senators, one from Florida and one from Louisiana. Now, David Yulee Levy was born in the English West Indies, and as a child, his family came to Florida. The purpose of the family's move to Florida is his father, Moses, a Sephardic Jew, dreamed of a remote Jewish colony, a safe homeland free of religious persecution. The Spanish Inquisition was still on the minds of Jewry around the world, and Moses picked out Micanopy. Anyone heard of Alachua County? It's near Gainesville, University of Florida area, as this, call it kibbutz, call it whatever you'd like. He arrived in 1821. Florida's Jewish population numbered 30 to 40, all there at the location in Micanopy. Well, the colony didn't really work out. It's not surprising, as Hebrews had already discovered that the New World, particularly the South, was fairly tolerant of Jewish people. After all, the third and fourth oldest synagogues in the world, in the New World, were in Charleston and Savannah, respectively. He attended law school. He became a railroad man. He owned several railroads in Florida. He was Florida's first congressman after she was admitted to the Union. He became, senator after she was admitted to the Union. He was at the secession convention for Florida and was an avid secessionist. He became a Florida congressman to the Confederate States of America. He was targeted by Federals because he had sugar plantations and sugar mills, and they were burned. He was captured after the war. I can't tell you the bounty on his head, but he was imprisoned at Fort Pulaski, and we have a city and a county in Florida named after him. Yulee County and Levy County and Yulee, Florida. So this is your first Jewish senator to the United States, David Yulee Levy.
Do you know if he died in prison or was
he was released? He was eventually released. Okay, let's talk about material aid to the cause before we get into actual military service. Someone who provided material aid to the cause could be simply a farmer who provided food or horses or mules to the Confederacy. It could be a diplomat, an emissary. Some people have asked me, where did you get your dress? I said, from the blockade runner. Privateers who owned their own ships and at great risk. You may recall Rhett Butler in the movie Gone with the Wind. He actually got involved in a tad bit of blockade running. This was done for profit, but also to bring supplies into the Confederacy. Civilian physicians and veterinarians. Civilian hospital workers, nurses, aides, cooks, servants, civilian field nurses, and slaves too, including women who nursed soldiers in their homes, chaplains and rabbis who ministered to the armies, and spies or intelligence agents. How intriguing. Spies and intelligence agents. Well, here is one of my favorite lady Confederates, Rose O'Neal Greenhouse. Anyone heard of Rose? Her nickname was Rebel Rose. I like this lady. Let me tell you a little bit about her pedigree. She was born in 1817 in Maryland. She was from a prominent family, and she married Robert, a State Department official, and became on the who's who list of Washington society. For example, she would enjoy the company of Jolly Madison, Daniel Webster, and James Buchanan at her home. She was an ardent Southern patriot. She wrote, "I'm a Southern woman born with revolutionary blood in my veins." She did have a patriot ancestor. So at the outbreak of the war, she did what she could for the Confederacy, and by all accounts, she did it well. She was a Confederate operative, a spy. She gathered any information she could use about military troop movements, politicians, affairs, politics, and the Lincoln government, and fed it through a system of codes to her connections in the Confederacy. She later wrote, "To this end, I employed every capacity which with God had endowed me, and the result was far more successful than my hopes could have flattered me to expect." I will let you read between the lines on that. Her MO was flattering officers and government officials into revealing military secrets. In addition to her own efforts, she recruited other beautiful Southern belles in Washington to extract information from gullible men. Among her most notable accomplishments was the 10-word secret message she sent to General Beauregard, which ultimately caused him to win the Battle of Bull Run. She spied so successfully the Confederacy that Jefferson Davis himself credited her for the winning of the Battle of Manassas. Alan Pinkerton was the head of the famous detective agency, had been brought from Chicago by the Lincoln to track and capture rebel operatives in Washington, D.C., and she made his short list. When he arrested her, she says, "I have no power to resist you, but had I been inside my house, I would have killed you before I had submitted to this illegal process." She was placed under house arrest and for 8 days not allowed to be out of sight of Union guards, not even for a moment, watching her every move. She was understandably indignant. Her home became a women's prison, later became known as Fort Greenhouse. She was, along with her 8-year-old daughter, Little Rose, moved to Old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. Despite her confinement, she still used her spy network to get messages through. Lincoln finally felt she was so incorrigible and so damaging that he exiled her south, and she went to England to do some work there. And coming back, unfortunately, her vessel ran aground and she was lost at sea. She was buried with full military honors in Oakdale Cemetery in Wilmington. Her coffin is wrapped during her ceremony with a Confederate flag and carried by Confederate soldiers. The marker for her grave, a marble cross, bears the epitaph, Miss Rose N. Greenhow, a bearer of dispatches to the Confederate government. Material aid continued. Okay, we've talked about, we did. Citizens who aided and abetted the Confederate military in the performance of their duties, including partisans and guerrillas, servants, slaves, laborers, cooks, including free men of color. And a man I know, H.K. Edgerton, says that if it were not for the contribution of the slave and free blacks, the Confederacy would not have lasted a day, because they were certainly outnumbered. Citizens who had to sign the amnesty oath after the U.S. To the U.S. after the war, anyone who signed that would be have given material aid because obviously they felt like they needed to. And citizens who were arrested by the U.S. as a result of espousal of the Confederate cause. So President Lincoln arrested about 40,000 Northerners and placed them without habeas corpus into federal prison because of their espousal for the Confederate cause, including a lot of the people at Harvard University. Okay, now we're going to get into the military. So you've gotten the quick overview of Confederate personalities. But before we do, seems like I've left out a couple people. How'd that happen? Let me refer you to this document just briefly, and I'm going to mention two other people very quickly. There's a handsome fellow right here in a uniform on the inside. So did everybody have one of these? This is Simon Baruch, who is a Confederate States surgeon. Anyone recognize that name? Yes. Okay. Bernard. His son was Bernard. So there's
my grandfather's classmate.
And it's said that Simon would go to the theater in New York, and when the playing of Dixie arose, he stood and sang as loud as he could. And then another lady I'd like to mention here, everyone's, I'm sure, have heard of Clara Barton. Yes. Well, who has heard of Phoebe Yates Pember? Okay, here's a photograph of Phoebe Yates Pember. Let me see if I can give you a few good facts on her real fast. I believe she was from a prosperous Charleston family. Her husband had died of tuberculosis just before the war, and she felt the need to be of use. And she used her connections to weasel her way into nursing. She had experience in it, and she was actually made matron, and forgive my spelling, Chimborazo Hospital. And here's a picture of it. This is on a bluff in Richmond, Virginia. This was the largest military hospital in the day, and she was the matron of that hospital. It opened in 1861, covering 40 acres with a capacity of 3,000, and more than 76,000 Confederate soldiers were treated there. She dedicated herself to doing everything possible to relieving the suffering, administering medication, assisting surgeons in operations, frequently without anesthetic, and patching wounds herself. She served as the final companion to the dying, writing letters, reading stories, holding hands, praying and talking. It was an atmosphere of misery and despair. It was a time of depravity. Everything was in short supply. A turkey was $50 to $100, milk $4 a quart, and that's not adjusted for inflation. The little food Phoebe was able to obtain for her patients had to be rationed. She wrote, "It was almost ludicrous to see with what a painful solitude we would count the rolls, or hold a council over the pans of cornbread to decide who would be fed." Prior to Richmond falling and with the exodus of Confederate forces, she was faced with a decision to either flee for safety for her own self or to stay and care for the men who could not be moved. you know what she did. She stayed, she put a pistol in her pocket, and when confronted by some men wanting to steal her medicinal whiskey, she said, "You had better leave, for if one bullet is lost, there are 5 more ready, and the room is so small for even a woman to miss 6 times." Well, eventually the army did come, and the Union commander felt so sorry for her and the situation that he provided plenty for the men who were still left there. And she stayed on at the hospital until either all the sick were convalescent or passed away. So that's Phoebe Timber Yates. Clara Barton didn't have anything up on her. All right, so now let's get into your Confederate. Who in the room thinks they might have one looking at that map? Okay, I know you do, and I know you do. Anyone else think they might?
Well, come on, ask us about our union.
And by the way, all this that I'm talking about will apply if you want to research the boys in blue. But here's our dates. The war year was 61 to 65. So when we start looking for a likely prospect of a man who served, and there were women who dressed as men and served. I actually have a lady in our chapter who, her great-great-grandmother went to war with her husband for fear that he would die on the battlefield and not make it home. Happened very often. So she went with him disguised as a man. When he was injured, she got a discharge after revealing herself to the commanding officer. So the men we're looking for were born between 1825 and 1849. Now there could be younger men that served. Bell's babies were dispatch carriers, and they were 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So they could be younger. But this is what you're going to find typically as your rank and file soldier. And of course, we already know the states that they came from. Now, I know that when you checked out this event, we use the term Civil War very loosely as a way to describe the conflict. Well, what you're going to find is when we get into the service records, the soldiers actually worked for the state. There was a few field and staff that worked for the Confederate States. Same thing with the Union. But it's the 7th Florida Infantry, or the Alabama, what? 6th Alabama. So it's actually in the Daughters of the Confederacy, and this was approved by Congress by an act, war between the states, because it was Georgia fighting against Massachusetts, and it was Maine fighting against Tennessee. So technically, war between the states is the term that accurately describes the conflict. The South didn't fight for control of the North. They just want to be left alone. Okay, here's our military organization. It's very helpful to understand this when we start getting into looking at our men and their service record. The largest population of military service was the Army, as compared to the Navy, which there was both. There was even Marines. Robert E. Lee's son was a Marine. And in the Army, the largest population was the infantry. So if you have a Confederate ancestor, the likelihood is that you will find him in the infantry. Now, I do have a cavalryman. I don't have an artilleryman, but that's a possibility. And again, we talk about this. They were raised and financed by the individual states, and very few were actually government forces. And you could tell it's a government force because it would say 7th Regiment Confederate Cavalry as compared to 5th Regiment Louisiana Infantry. See the distinction?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, now let's talk about the chain of command, because this is really helpful in organizing and figuring out where the officers and the enlisted men fall. The largest population of Army was the privates. These are the men doing the fighting on the front line. There was 50 privates in a company. A battalion was made up of 3 companies, which has 150 privates. And by the way, this is in your handout on the left-hand side, so you don't have to take too much of a copious note. A regiment made up of 3 battalions, so that's 500 privates. A brigade, 3 regiments, 500 privates. A division, 3 brigades, 4,500 privates. A corps, 3 divisions, 15,000 privates. and an army, 3/4, 45,000 privates. So that sort of gives you an understanding. Now, as men were killed or became disabled, the ranks would drop, and they would try to fill in, maybe through additional recruiting or by consolidating. So you actually might find one man in multiple units because the units were renamed and consolidated. So make a note if you have that happen. It could be that it actually were consolidated to fill in the ranks. Now, the nomenclature for the Southern Army and the Northern armies were different. In the South, the armies were named based on the land area. The Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of Tennessee, the Army of the Trans-Mississippi. The Northern Army was based on waterways. For example, Army of the Potomac. Okay, now let's talk about officers. A company was commanded by a captain, who was assisted by a first lieutenant. A battalion was commanded by a lieutenant colonel or colonel. A regiment was commanded by a colonel. A brigadier general commanded a brigade. A lieutenant general commanded a corps. And a major general commanded a division or army. So, for example, Stonewall Jackson was, I think, a lieutenant general. Lee was a major general. Okay, now, we've got a suspect. We've figured out somebody in our family tree that might possibly be a Confederate. He lived in one of the states. He was the right age. So now, let's go see what we can find. And again, this is in your package as well. So what we want to do is we want to see what we can find out about this potential man's service. Now there's a lot of sources that I'm going to reference you today. Some are printed, some are online. So we're going to go through both of those categories. The compiled military service record, and I have an example here of my boyfriend, Alex Hart, who we're going to talk about later, that happens to be pretty long. Now, he was a major, so an officer's service record might be a little bit more involved than a private's. But this is amazingly available from the National Archives. You can obtain them from the UDC Business Office. You can obtain them from Broadfoot Publishing Company. You can go down to Morrow, Georgia, and pick one up at the National Archives there, or you can log on to the National Archives online and sit in your nightgown and type in your credit card and have it be delivered to you in the U.S. mail. And for those of you who've not been to the Georgia Archives, I have some information here for you. Does everyone know where that is in Morrow? Okay. All right, great. I think they only have the Georgia microfilm, but next door I believe they have the full set of both Union and Confederate. There's authoritative books that will mention Confederate service, and many states did approve pensions. Now, if you were a Union soldier, you'd draw a federal pension, but they were not awarded up until, I don't think they were actually ever awarded to Confederate soldiers, so it was the states that were responsible for providing a pension. And they did start doing that around the turn of the century. And then the good old internet, just looking up regimental histories and Googling a name will sometimes turn up information. Let's get into some of the authoritative sources. There has been books written using all sorts of sources, and none of them are completely comprehensive. So that's the caveat I will give you, that although these sources are excellent, they're not completely comprehensive. For example, in Georgia, Lillian Henderson worked at the archives, and she came up with a roster of Confederate soldiers of Georgia. I'm researching a friend surnamed Brooks. He was in the Home Guard. He's not in the book. Okay? So, you have to look not just one place, you want to check multiple places. The ones that have the asterisk are available at your state archives here in Morrow. And I'm sure the rest you could get through interlibrary loan if you're interested in checking out that state. Now, the next category I'm going to talk about is internet sources. This is the front page of my chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy website. And I have given you my business card in your folio that has the website address on it. But it's also circled up here in red at the top, AugustaJamesUDC.org. And the reason I'm giving you this as a source is because under our How to Join button, we've got a plethora of online resources. The first one being the National Parks Database. This is basically an index of all of these. They haven't got it finished for the Navy, but they do have it finished for the Army. So, this is what it looks like when you click on that link. The Civil War Soldiers and Sailors System. And we're going to talk about a fellow that I really like. And I have to reference one of my favorite sources on this subject, a book by Robert Rosen, who is an attorney in Charleston, who has done, as you can see, a lot of work. It's very well bibliographed. And I discovered Alex Hart through this book. I was just really flipping through the book. I saw the picture and I said, he looks interesting. And so I said, let me find out a little bit more about him. So I'm going to introduce you to my boyfriend, Alex Hart, today. And there's a lot, and we're going to skip through this very quickly because we won't have time to cover everything. We're going to sort of take this as a case study from the beginning, like you would finding your ancestor. So here is Alexander Hart on the 1860 census. In Louisiana, Orleans Parish, New Orleans, Ward 1. So, he is 20 years old in 1860, which puts him right in the range of the timeline. He was born in 1840, so that's perfect. At the time, he was a store clerk, probably in his father's tailor shop. As you can see, his father is a shirt manufacturer. His father and mother were born in England. Alexander was born in Louisiana. You can see below there he does have a younger brother or two and a younger sister or two. So he's our subject. Now in Louisiana, you don't really think of that as a hotbed of Jewish residency, but their first synagogue was in 1820 in the French Quarter. A large wave of migration brought the Ashkenazi Jews in the 1840s and 50s. And by 1860, there were 5 synagogues, 80,000 Jews in the state, 25 to 50% of Southern Jews were located there. New Orleans, 4,000, with the 7th largest Jewish population in the U.S. and the largest in the state. And Shreveport being the 2nd largest population of Jews. And according to the London Times, the governor was under the influence of Hebrews. They had power and prestige in Louisiana. So we're going to go ahead back to our Civil War soldiers and sailors, and I use that just because that's what they call it. It drives me crazy. And look up Alexander Hart, just as an example to see what we're going to find. So here's our search screen. We're going to look up Hart. We're going to select Confederate, because that will narrow it down, and we won't be bothered by the Unions. We know he's from Louisiana, but you know what? I'm going to leave that blank just for now. And guess what? We come up with 1,347 records. Quite a few A's. And if you do research in that time, you'll find that many men go by initials. They don't necessarily go by their names. So let's see if we can narrow it down now to Louisiana. So I'm going to go back to the search screen again. Can everyone see okay? Because I do have some of this in your handout. So here we go to Louisiana, and now we only have 81 possible Harts. And I have 2 A initials. I have 2 Alex Alexanders. So I have 4 names of interest. Because Abraham, Allen, they're really not of interest if I'm looking for Alexander. Okay, so let's narrow down these. And when you click on the name you will get details of his service. So, here's what we find. We find on the first A, it's actually Arthur. So that's not my guy, because we know his name's Alexander. So 1 down, 3 to go. So here's the second A. And he is the Orleans Guards Regiment of the state militia. Well, we know he's from New Orleans. This might be a clue. Let's look at the next one. This one's a surgeon. Well, we have no indication that Alex, being store clerk, was a surgeon. So I think we can rule that one out. A little deductive thinking here goes a long way. And then, so here's our last one, Alexander, who's the 5th Regiment. Now, this one is particularly of interest to me, but let's explore it. He's actually showing here as a major, this fellow. Going in as a first lieutenant and out as a major. Now, the one we saw before, if you didn't notice, I'll remind you, he was actually listed as a private. So we have 2, and we're not sure if either of them or both of them are our man. So now we have to boil it down a little bit more. This 5th Infantry Regiment was organized at, guess where? New Orleans. Well, that's sounding pretty interesting. And then look at the very last line. Major Alexander Hart. Okay, well, this is getting interesting. So here's our 2. We have the Orleans Guards, Louisiana Militia, and then we have the 5th Regiment where he went in as a lieutenant and it came out as a major. So, it could be one or the other or both, or they could be the same man. Now, Ancestry.com, how can we really be sure? Well, it's really going to be hard. It would be nice if somebody would tell us that Louisiana Guards was rolled into the 5th Regiment. It'd be nice if someone said that, but we haven't seen that yet. But a census search in 1860 only shows one Alexander Hart in New Orleans. So since both these units were from New Orleans, now we have a clue that they're the same man. Follow me on my deductive thinking here? Makes sense? Anybody argue with my process of thought? Okay. All right, good. All right, now, on our chapter webpage, we do have some additional sources, like I say, a plethora of them. One of them is the Louisiana Index, which is actually an online version of the source authoritative book that we talked about earlier. So I'm just going to do a little lookup here of Mr. Hart. And here's our 2, A. Hart and Alexander Hart. And it tells us a little bit more than what we found out earlier. Absent, wounded at Sharpsburg. Absent, wounded at Gettysburg. Detailed in Department Henrico, which is actually means he was at headquarters in Richmond. Here he is in the hospital again, transferred to, it was a prisoner of war, transferred for exchange. And here he is, occupation clerk, born in New Orleans, age 22. Well, that to me is really sort of helping me figure out that this guy is definitely him. So the question is the first guy him? So here's a little bit more information. This is a Google of the Orleans Guard. And like I said, when you use this internet searching stuff, it turns up interesting things. In 1862, the local militias were organized and placed under the command of Major General Mansfield Lovell, who was charged with the defense of New Orleans. Okay, so that's a local guard. And then another Google search on the 5th Louisiana Infantry says that the 5th was organized in New Orleans in May of 1861. Well, nothing definitive yet. So we're still not sure if this is our same guy, but it's smelling like they might be. So now we get into the actual service record. And again, if you order this up, this is what you get. So now there's actually 2 service records. There's one for Alexander, and then there's one for A. This is the private, this is the officer. The A isn't very long. This is the officer. Okay, so you're going to see some fun things in here as we go through it quickly. The very first thing of the service record is a card, an index card. And you have an example of this in your folder. And this research that's provided here in the service records was done to the Great Works Project during the Depression. They had all these little scraps of papers in boxes. And they said, go through there and organize all these scraps. And so every time there was a scrap, they wrote it on a card. And then they put a table of contents as an index card. So that's what you're looking at here, is this is the table of contents. So Company B, Louisiana Militia, one card. That's it. That's it. Has a unit at the top. He's shown on the muster roll as the rank of private. That's it. That's all we know. That's it. Okay, let's look at the other record. Okay, this is Alexander. We already knew he went in as first lieutenant and out as major. There's his name at the top, followed by the unit, and there's 32 cards listed. Okay, here's what a record card looks like a little more up close. This one shows he enlisted June 4, 1861, which was after that other unit was formed. And shows him being appointed in as first lieutenant and then promoted to captain in August. So this actually shows his promotion. Okay, here's another card. This sort of is duplicative to the previous one, and sometimes you'll find that. There might be multiple records. This one's showing him side by side with the previous record. No, that's not right. What am I showing you? Oh yeah, the two appointment records. The dates don't match, so there's obviously some slightly different records, sources that they're using there. He was enlisted for the war, which was very common because they thought it was going to be done in just a few months and everybody go home and be done with it. They were wrong. Now, here's a pay voucher. These men did get paid. Alex was paid $198. You won't see this in every service record. Okay, as an officer, he was responsible for, this is still part of his pay voucher. He was using my inflation calculator that worked up to $32,000 a year. They had no income taxes, so it felt like 41. Now, one thing I love about these service records is sometimes you'll get a signature where he signed for his pay. That's pretty fun when you can find your ancestor's autograph. So that's Alex. Nice penmanship. Okay, well, where was he when he got paid? Well, he was originally sent to the Peninsula Campaign. So he's near, Groves Wharf was 8 miles from Yorktown, Virginia. And Union General McClellan, you may have heard of him, was positioned in Maryland and was trying to march to Richmond. And there's a song about that, on all the attempts to capture Richmond and how it took 5 years, but he was the first one that tried. Now, here is Alex. He is absent on furlough. This was February of, I'm sorry, that's a typo, 1862, wrong war. Okay.
1862.
And now he goes back. It was a sort of, he's back, and he's waiting for McClellan in Northern Virginia. And when he gets back, this is a requisition, so part of his duties was to make sure that his men were appropriately dressed. So he's ordering caps, jackets, pants, and shoes. Had some paperwork he had to do when he got back. And there it is. There's a little bit more detail of the documents is actually folded, and so there's a cover and then the inside detail. Okay, so here's things heated up in the summer. McClellan moves, and there's several battles on Virginia's peninsula, including Williamsburg. But by the 5th, his unit was transferred to the Valley. And with Stonewall Jackson. You've heard about the Valley Campaign. Well, this is where Alex spent most of his time. And this is just a nice map that shows how they went back and forth up through the valley. The Blue Ridge is on this side, and the Alleghenies on that side, and a lot of interesting terrain, and just trying to keep the Federals from marching through the valley and getting to Richmond that way. Now, Alex's unit, the 5th Regiment, was assigned to General Yulee, and some of you have heard of this campaign. The Confederates were outnumbered 4-1, and Jackson's men were known as the foot cavalry because they could march on foot as fast as mounted men. Alex was there on June 8th at the Battle of Staunton. July. Okay, and now he's on a list of wounded and missing in Yulee's division. He was wounded at the Battle of Sharpsburg. So there he is. His first injury. Okay, he got sent home on furlough. If you were an injured soldier after you got out of the hospital, you were given a furlough, generally for 45 days, to go home and recuperate. And there he is. And he's not back yet. But he's present. He's stationed at Hamilton's Crossings. This is all in the Shenandoah Valley. Now, this is interesting. Forage. He is requisitioning forage. What is forage? That is food for your horse. He has come back with a horse. Here is his expense report. So he's requesting food for his horse. Daily allowance to each animal. There it is. Requisition for forage for horses.
Does that mean that if he was had gone home on his furlough,
He got a horse.
and he
Brought it
came
back
all
with
the
him.
way back by
Yes, ma'am.
horse?
Yes, ma'am. Or he took the rail and got the horse in the neighborhood. I can't tell you for sure.
Oh, okay.
We can only
That's
speculate.
a long way to.
But he got the horse somewhere along the way, either there or back.
I know you said this, but did you get all of that from the internet? All these little things you're showing us?
This is the service records. The maps that I'm filling
No,
in.
I mean other than the maps. The service record thing.
No, well, you can order it. But you could get it at the Georgia Archives or from the UDC or off the internet. But you have to order it and it comes U.S. mail. $17.
But somebody else had to put all that together is what
Yeah, that's the National Works Project during the Depression. Mhm. So now here it is, the Second Battle of Winchester, June 13 to 15, 1863. In June, General Lee ordered General Yulee to clear the lower Shenandoah Valley of Union troops. 19,500 men were on the field at the third battle with 4,700 casualties, 95% Union. Alex was there, this time on his horse. After fighting on the afternoon of June the 3rd, the Louisiana Brigade, that would be Hart's men, captured the West Fort. Sensing defeat, that night 2,500 Federals were captured, and the Confederate victory drove the Federal Army out of the Shenandoah Valley. So he was at that battle. Shortly thereafter occurs Gettysburg. Both armies then moved north towards Pennsylvania. 172,000 men would face off in the three-day battle, the bloodiest battle on American soil, 51,000 casualties, more than the Revolutionary War put together. 30% of Hart's regiment would not survive. And by the way, I didn't tell you this, but his regiment was the Louisiana Tigers. These were the rough and tumble dock workers from New Orleans. They wouldn't let just anybody boss them around. So this nice little Jewish boy who was a clerk was not only started out as a private, lieutenant, captain, and now major. Okay. Now, guess what? Wounded at Gettysburg. Here he is. Now, what does he have? Oh, what's the next one? VS left hand. VS. I don't know what a VS to the left hand is. Who knows what that is? Vulnus sclopecticum. Sclopecticum. Gunshot wound.
Yeah.
Okay? So he's absent, detached to the Department of Enrico, basically on permanent disability. Must have been a pretty bad injury. But he is working at headquarters. He's got a desk job. Okay, well, just like I do on a business trip, he wasn't sleeping in the field in a tent anymore, or in a neighbor lady's house in the Shenandoah Valley, so he's having to rent a hotel room. So he's turning an expense report here. And again, you're not going to get this on a private. This is going to be on an officer. And here he is. He's saying $88, $30, 4 rooms, $30 per month, for a total of $185.57. And again, there's his signature. So now you have 2 signatures in file. Isn't that nice? Now he's back to war. This is March and April 1864. So he's back with his regiment, but not for long. Here he is on hospital register again. There he is again. Okay, now he's back at Winchester. So he had some problem, but now he's back in action. Now, it's really wonderful when you can actually find a diary on somebody. And I Googled Alex Hart. Guess what pops up? A diary. And so I'm not going to read you all this, but July 4, 1864, basically Lee has said, everybody that's in Richmond, we need to do a Hail Mary pass in the Shenandoah Valley because the end is upon us. So he gets dispatched to go round up all the guys he could find, sort of almost off sick duty, like on the edge of actually being functioning, and taking them over to the valley. And so here he is. He leaves July 6th at the railroad. They camp for the night. On the 7th, they get up and start marching at 4:30 a.m. They get to Staunton, remember the name of that town, at 7:30 a.m., many men complaining, 80 examined by surgeons, 35 unfit for duty. So he left them, and they continued on at 4:30 the next morning. They marched 25 miles. They were issued rations, and the ladies of the town cooked them for them. The 12th, they skirmished with the enemy, moved at 9 p.m. 2 miles south, and took up a line of battle. And he says his brigade, the Louisianans, were on the mountaintop. 12, 13, 14, 15, still in that same position. 17, at sunrise, they marched towards Winchester. Now, this is going to be the 3rd Battle of Winchester. Reached the town at 2 p.m., rested an hour, formed in a line of battle, commenced to advance, skirmish hourly. The enemy retreated slowly, following continually. Ordered to halt, the Yankees continued to retreat. Ordered to rest and cook rations. Casualties were few. Finally, we've engaged the 6th Army Yankee Corps. 60,000 men commanded by Sheridan, who they ran into. On the 19th, 4 a.m., again, marched toward Winchester. Went within 3 miles of town, heard heavy firing, and about 10 a.m. met the enemy. Fought in our front with success, but 4 p.m. left the army giving way in confusion, compelled Gordon Division to follow rapidly, after which the troops rallied twice, but broke at last into complete rout. Captured 5 o'clock, my horse wounded in 3 places, died in West Winchester that night. So his horse was shut out from under him and died. And guess what? Now he's in the hospital. But did you see the date on that? Admitted September 13th. And what was the date of our battle? Was August 19th. So now he was captured. He was in a USA hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. It's taken him almost a month to get there. Well, it doesn't get better for him. He was transported by wagon, remained in a little church, and it was just a really long procedure. He was finally paroled on October 30th as a POW. Now, what they did is they would exchange Northern for Southern, And so he was transferred and released. He arrived in Fort Delaware, and is exchanged October 31st. And here is where they took surrender of him. Oh, nope, this is where he actually said, you know what, I want my money for my horse back. This is his horse claim. First thing he did when he got released, he says his horse is worth $1,100, $16,000 in today's money. So he wanted his money back for his horse. All right, well, here's his diary. It talks about how everybody was so happy that they didn't know that he'd been released. The ladies of the town tried to make them comfortable, and he saw Mr. Alex Abrams, who accepted an invitation to stay at his house. He got his parole papers and started for Columbia. He put up at the Nicholson House, went to visit Joe Mark, started for Charleston, then went to see the Hilburns. He started for Richmond, arrived on the 20th, and he started to see his fiancée and all the folks. They were glad to see me. Leona Pride, I'm supposing that's his fiancée. Stayed in Richmond and basically for December and November. As you can see, he had a lot of connections in the Southern Jewish community. Well, unfortunately, though, in January, he was declared unfit for duty, but he didn't take no for an answer. He showed up at Camp Stafford, which is near Petersburg, which we've talked about earlier. General Grant had Lee's army tied down there during the whole winter. You've probably heard the Battle of the Crater. That was there. So, but the military doctors said, you know what? You're going to get out of here. His health, they said he wasn't really fit for duty, especially after spending time in that POW camp. And so they sent him to Louisiana Hospital and tried to do a discharge of him. And he was transferred to the Invalid Corps. Now, what the Invalid Corps was is basically a desk job where they did have things to do, but it didn't involve active duty. And then here's his diary. He says, okay, they made me do the paperwork. They examined me again. Okay, fine. So they sent him on a forage mission. They were sent him back home to try to round up supplies. So here's his diary. He says, I'm going to leave, for my new desk job. I packed up at 3 p.m., 4 p.m., heard noise in the street. Mrs. Ezekiel called me. Heard from her that the city was about to be evacuated as our troops were beaten. Hurried my preparations, said goodbye, 3 p.m., got on a train full of all kinds of people. Mr. B. Florence also there. Captain Zeke Levy, Mr. Ezekiel, and several others came to the depot with me. Left folks in Richmond in great distress. Uncle Abraham loaned me $1,000 in bonds to give Mr. Getz. He arrived in Danville. That's the city where the Confederate cabinet had their last meeting. All confusion. Confederate cabinet in town. Got away on train for Galsop. Arrived there 5th. Stayed all night. Saw Jack Abrams. 6th. Arrived at Charlotte. Stayed 2 days. Passover. Gave Gila matzos. Brought her from Richmond. 8th. Started for Augusta. Arrived at 7 p.m. Stopped by Savannah Hotel. Sold bonds for $100 in gold. Probably a good thing. Probably the best move he could make at the time, because Save Your Confederate Money Boys isn't really working. Visited Joe Marks and the other family. Supped with Reverend Henry Jacobs. Started for LaGrange. Stayed with the Jones house. Went to Atlanta to get paroled, because the war is over now. Lee surrendered on the 9th. Okay?
Very good.
Let's see, hang on. There's one other thing. Oop, how did I get so far past? That was a boo-boo. Okay. Bought a mule for $40, saddled $10 in gold, started from Montgomery, arrived there 4 a.m., saw Aunt Fanny and all my relations, stayed with them a week, started for Mobile, arrived Mobile 2 p.m., took a steamer for New Orleans, and he arrived on the 17th, 4 p.m., once more at home, thank God, did not get into town till 10 p.m., went to the house, woke up Uncle Abe, Mother, all came down and disabled, said shouting and kissing.
No, not pressed.
Yes, dress, okay. Thank you. All were full of Thanksgiving, retired after midnight. So he's made it home. And here is where, when you order his service record, you can find out that they did show his service on file. Now, another search of Google shows that this fellow, Mr. Hart, came back to the Shenandoah Valley after the war. This is actually the website for Temple House of Israel. It is a synagogue. He started in 1876 in Staunton, and when they had their 100th year anniversary, they did a profile on Alexander Hart. And in this book, there's actually a picture of him. There you have it. According to his bio, he was an active Mason and commander of a camp of the United Confederate Veterans. He served as president of the synagogue for 18 years, but he's missing some hair. He's not quite as handsome as he was in the first picture. The state that he lived in later, he drew a pension. Virginia, yes. His wife drew a Confederate pension, a widow's pension, which is approved January 17th, 1917. So that's what a pension application looks like. Okay. Now, is this an anomaly? No. As a percentage of population in the South, more Jews fought and died for the Confederacy than any member of any other ethnic group. And the only Hebrew military cemetery outside of Israel is in Richmond, Virginia. Here it is. I've been there. You can see the rifles. You can see these are rifles. These are sabers. These are laurel wreaths. These are the rammers for the cannons. And there is a lovely marker dedicated by the Hebrew Ladies Memorial Association in memory of the Hebrew Confederate soldiers resting in this hallowed spot to the glory of God. Alex is not buried there, but it's a nice place. He had a brother, Sidney. He also served. And then I'm going to mention to you one more example. And in your handout, there is a description of this fellow, Raphael Moses. Now, has anyone heard of the founder of the Peach State? Okay, well, this is your man. He was born in Charleston. He moved to Columbus, Georgia. He was quite a businessman. And he discovered the way to ship fresh peaches out of the state, apparently using champagne baskets. And at the time of the war, he became the chief commissary officer for General James Longstreet and was responsible for feeding his army. He carried out the last order of the Confederate cabinet, which was to take the remaining treasury and to feed the disabled and indigent Confederate soldiers. And so he is your Georgia Confederate connection. So how do you feel about all this?
Very interesting.
It's very interesting.
It's wonderful that they have had so much documentation.
Well, is anyone excited about maybe finding their ancestor? You know, some people are actually ashamed that they might think that they might have one. I hope that will not be you. I have some parting thoughts just to share with you. Here's what Lincoln said about slavery. If I could keep the Union together by freeing all the slaves, I'd do that. If I could free none, I'd do that. If I could free some and not others, I'd do that. As you can see, he was really not strongly opinioned on that subject. The fact of the matter was the southern states paid in excess of 80% of the treasury. Ladies and gentlemen, it was about the money. Okay, here are some attitudes of anti-Semitism. South versus North. In the Confederacy, Jewish chaplains were allowed to serve in the South. In the North, federal chaplains had to be regularly ordained ministers of some Christian denomination. This is from the military procedures. And some of you may have heard of this.
Yeah.
General Order Number 11, anyone heard of this?
Yeah.
Okay. For those of you who haven't, let me read it for you. The Jews as a class violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, by the way, Grant's family did the same thing, are hereby expelled from the department within 24 hours from the receipt of this order. Post commanders will see to it that all class of people being furnished passes and required to leave, and anyone returning after such notification will be arrested and held in confinement until an opportunity occurs of sending them out as prisoners unless furnished with permit. No passes will be given. General Ulysses S. Grant. Basically, he was unhappy with the traders, the merchants. And even though he had family that was doing the same thing, he picked on the Jews. Now this, in all fairness, Lincoln delegation was sent and he did reverse it. But our great Union General Grant, that was his solution to the problem. Okay, now I have to invite you to join the Daughters of the Confederacy. We're the nation's oldest patriotic organization. We started out as a veterans support group. We are educational. We give scholarships to deserving young people and older people alike. We are historical. We are memorial. We decorate graves on Confederate Memorial Day. And anyone who has a Confederate ancestor directly up their line or an uncle, we call that collateral, is eligible, who served honorably. So Our chapter website is here. It's on my card. If you find your ancestor, I'd love to help you do any finishing touches on his service and get you in the UDC. And I'm also going to plug the Sons of Confederate Veterans. There's a brochure in your folder about the SCV, and you can get to them from that website. And that's the Sons of Confederate Veterans. So, the men have sons and the ladies have daughters.
Is it only the soldiers or do the material aid?
Material aid counts. Absolutely. Well, I have probably run over by about 5 minutes, so I would be glad to answer a couple questions, but we're probably almost out of time. But anyone have any thoughts or questions?
First of all, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If that would be more appropriate.
You have a couple questions?
There is a library at Marietta, Georgia that has an excellent genealogy section. You need to comment on that.
Well, why don't you mention it?
Well,
I've not been there. I live in Florida.
that's all I'm going to mention. It's in Marietta, which is just up the road here, and you can look up a lot of things we were doing over there once. Not necessarily Jewish ancestry, but just all Confederate history.
Well, thank you.
Isn't that the public library?
Yeah.
Cobb County.
Yeah, the Cobb County Public
Yeah,
Library.
Cobb
is
County.
wonderful genealogy.
Right.
Great. Any questions?
I just have one comment. I was in Jackson, Mississippi for a meeting, and I don't know if any of you have been to the Capitol in Jackson, Mississippi, but outside in the front there is a memorial, sculptures to the women of the Confederacy, and it's 4 parts. It's shaped, like this, and one is to the daughters, and there's a script about daughters. One's to the wives, and one's to the sisters, and one's to the mothers. They're beautiful figures, and then the text is very lovely. So I've seen a lot of Confederate, memorials, and this, I've never seen one, these two women. Usually they're for the Confederate soldier. But this one was for women, and for these 4.
There's actually a very large monument to the women of the Confederacy in Jacksonville, Florida. So there are monuments to women of the Confederacy, because you know what? They were at home keeping, food or whatever, clothing, coats, jackets coming the way, because the money was very tight. And they did scrimp and save, and they tried to really help out the men that they had sent off to war. And you know what? It was sort of a women's war in a lot of ways, because, some of the guys really weren't into it, but the women said, this is a matter of principle. We need to stand up. And I will tell you that the very first, and we have all this controversy with the battle flag. And by the way, this was never a flag of the government. This was a flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. This was a battle flag. This flag's model was designed by Mr. Porcher, who was a congressman from South Carolina, and was adopted by General Beauregard after there had been friendly fire accidents. And the prototype of this flag was sewn by some ladies, as most of the original unit flags were. So women had a very active role in all phases of symbols of the Confederacy.
Can you spend a minute talking about your costume and what the medals mean and things?
Absolutely. This is not period appropriate. This is the insignia of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Red, white, red is our insignia. You'll see this flag, which is our logo, is the first national flag. That was actually the flag of the government of the Confederate States of America. Now, you can see the similarity of that to the Betsy Ross flag, can't you? The circular star pattern with the red, white. The man who designed this was an Austrian, and those red and white stripes, he was an immigrant. I believe, no one's confirmed this, that he patterned that after the Austrian flag and patterned the red field with the white stars after the Betsy Ross flag. So our insignia has the red, white, and red, and this represents the ancestors that I have documented who served the Confederacy. I have a few more. The medals haven't come in yet. And then these are the offices and positions I've held in the United Daughters of the Confederacy. This shows I'm in the Florida Division.
A couple comments. I was very interested in Robert Rosen's last comment. I happened to hear Rosen in Charleston. My wife happens to be from Charleston.
How lucky you
and
are.
he's certainly a very authoritative, very good source of information regarding the percentage of Jews that participated in the Confederacy. We happened to be living in Athens, Georgia, and we were doing research, and several of us, on the children of Israel, the synagogue there, and one of the pieces written at about 1860 to 1870 was the fact that Jews did not participate in the Confederacy cause because it wasn't their war. So
They're wrong.
yeah, oh, absolutely,
They're
absolutely.
wrong. And I will tell you, no one knows exactly how many of any ethnic group did participate. There's been estimates of tens of thousands of the military who were Jews. The fact of the matter is they didn't count that way. So all the estimates have been based on surnames.
There's a slight error, if I may, and I don't want to detract from otherwise wonderful presentation. On your military ranks, command officer ranks, lieutenant generals, the 3-star on the bottom of page 2, the major generals, the 2-star, I think those should be reversed on the bottom right.
This came to me from an authoritative source. I don't know if the ranks are the same as they were then, but
That could have happened. I don't know about 19th century, but 20th century and 21st, it's the word.
Anything else? Well, it's been my pleasure to be with you today. I will stay and answer any one-on-one questions, and do accept my invitation to email me or call me if you need help with your genealogy and to find out more about the SCV or the UBC. Thank you.